Welcome to our third lecture video for unit number 3. Today we are going to be looking at philosophical foundations of the American Revolution, which is AP US History topic 3.4. So before we get into some of those philosophical foundations, I want to talk just a little bit about how trouble is really beginning to mount in the 1770s. Now, in the last video, we talked about taxation and increasing colonial resistance and unification of attempts at resistance throughout the 1760s and really the development of an early American kind of political identity. But, again, at this point, rebellion is not inevitable. In fact, by 1773, things were unsettled. People were still upset. The tea tax was still causing a lot of resistance, but rebellion was by no means inevitable. But then things began to take a more serious turn because of Boston. And again, this is one of those things you're probably pretty familiar with, the Boston Tea Party, which happened in 1773. So 1773, really, this was precipitated. The Boston Tea Party was really precipitated by a move by the British East India Company, who was given a monopoly on the tea trade in the colonies. Now, they had a ton of tea to get rid of. They were able to sell it at very low prices, even with this hated tea tax, which was something like 3 pennies, which was a lot back then. So even with this custom, this duty on the tea was being able to be sold really cheaply, but colonists actually saw this as like trickery, that the British government were just trying to find a way to make them swallow the tea tax, no pun intended. There was a lot of resistance to this. So when the British East India Company started to arrive with these ships of tea, they were met with resistance. A lot of merchants absolutely refused to take hold of the cargo. They refused to accept it. They refused to import it. And one royal governor in Boston was particularly insistent, though, that this go forward. In fact, ironically enough, he actually disliked the Tea Act itself, but he felt that flouting the law was wrong. So he basically said the ships weren't allowed to leave the Boston harbor until the chests of tea had been unloaded. And this is going to prompt a group of Bostonians dressed as Native Americans to go onto the ships and begin dumping chests of tea into the Boston harbor in protest. And hundreds of people watched this happen approvingly. Now, the reaction was a little bit varied. Many people approved of this action. Many people actually argues, including colonists, argue that it was too much to, violate the sanctity of private property. This would lead to destruction and violence. So not everybody was universally happy about this. But as you might imagine, the British government was furious. And this is going to lead to the passage of what become called in the American colonies as the Intolerable Acts in 1774. Now, there was a lot of things in these, but some of the worst restrictions, obviously, were on Boston. They closed the Boston harbor and basically said, look, we're not letting anyone in or out until damages are paid for. They also restricted a lot of things that were considered to be rights of the colonists in Massachusetts. They restricted town meetings. And they also said that officials who killed colonists in the line of performing their duties, whether that was enforcing taxes or protecting customs warehouses, they said that these British officials would no longer be tried in the American colonies, but they'd be sent back to Britain for trial, which the colonists saw as basically an excuse to say, well, we're just going to let them off. Okay, so the biggest, most important outcome of the Intolerable Acts is really the First Continental Congress. So this is a meeting of colonial leaders in Philadelphia. 12 out of the 13 colonies sent leaders who had all of the names you probably think of. George Washington and Patrick Henry and Benjamin Franklin are all there, and Sam Adams and John Hancock and Thomas Jefferson are all there to really consider ways to manage these colonial grievances. John Adams was very eloquent when he called for revolution. The more moderate sides are going to argue about the merits of revolution or home rule. This First Continental Congress is going to create a Declaration of Rights, not the Declaration of Independence quite yet, but a Declaration of Rights of the colonists, and they're going to call for a complete boycott of British goods. Now, it's important to note, although some of the more radical elements are calling for a revolution, for the most part, this Congress is aimed at appeal of offensive legislation. Even through a revolution, they were really not trying to get independence yet. They said, look, if you repeal these offensive tea acts and taxes, all well and good, we're gravy, we're cool, it's fine. But they agreed to meet again in May of 1775 and advance their grievances if something had not been fixed. Okay, so just before they were supposed to meet again in May of 1775, Lexington and Concord happens. This is in April of 1775. This was a Boston British official's attempt to seize colonial gunpowder. It really was beginning, tensions were simmering. It was beginning to see inevitable colonial militias were beginning to train, and this British official was attempting to prevent to confiscate a store of colonial gunpowder at Lexington and then possibly capture a few rebel ringleaders. And this is going to lead to the first bloodshed of the war. War had not been declared. There was even after Lexington and Concord, there were some attempts at ameliorating and preventing further outbreak of full war, but ultimately this is going to be the first bloodshed. And Ralph Waldo Emerson very famously later on declared that the first shot fired at Lexington and Concord was the shot heard round the world. Okay, so I just wanted to get you kind of caught up to where we are, which is just the eve of revolution, before we discuss the ideological underpinnings of the American Revolution. So what were they? And we've talked about some of these already, but this is just sort of an overview of them all together. Okay, so colonial political ideology had certain understandings, okay? First of all, most colonial leaders, the elites, believed that reason was the key to understanding the universe. They were mostly Enlightenment thinkers. They were increasingly seeing divine right to rule as an old, antiquated, illogical, illegitimate idea. Hereditary rule stood in the way of the natural order of things, according to colonial leaders and other Enlightenment thinkers. Now, it's important to note that they were not unified into like a single body politic. There was not one idea about politics. They all had different ideas of what liberty was, what it meant to be a British subject, whether or not they should continue to be British subjects, and what it meant to defy crown law. But increasingly, an ideology is beginning to emerge amongst American political thinkers. And if you're not sure what ideology is, it's just a body or set of political ideas that are connected to some movement or philosophy. So we're starting to see that emerge in the colonies. So again, Enlightenment has a huge influence on the American Revolution and early American politics, well, and modern American politics for that matter. So I call this Enlightenment soup in the colonies. There's a few ideas of different thinkers that are really, really going to be key to the development of American political ideology. Okay, the first is going to come from John Locke, who we've discussed before with Social Contract. His writing 2 treatises on government is going to be very influential on colonial elites. John Locke claimed that the power to govern is in the hands of the people, not the government itself, as in you need to have the consent of the governed to be able to govern correctly. He argued for natural rights, that all men were inherently born with rights that were not granted to them by a government, but by the creator, by God. And he enumerated these as being life, liberty, and property. And if this sounds familiar, that is because Thomas Jefferson unabashedly stole from John Locke when in writing the Declaration of Independence. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau is also going to argue for a social contract, much like John Locke. Again, the idea that people give up power to a government as long as the government agrees to protect their rights. But Rousseau argued, if a government doesn't actually hold up their end of the bargain, they're not a valid government anymore, and that citizens have a right and a duty to choose a new government. And then finally, the Baron de Montesquieu, who Montesquieu argued that Republican government or representative government preserved liberty. He argued for a government that has split the power between different bodies of men, a legislative, an executive, and a judicial branch of government, each having their own role and the ability to check and balance each other. And again, if that seems familiar, it is because literally that is the foundation of the American government, and we're going to talk about that more later on. But overall, colonists basically saw themselves, because of the Enlightenment and Enlightenment thought, as blessed with liberty, and any attempt to curtail that liberty by the British government, for example, was wrong. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about common sense. Okay, so classical republicanism is this notion of this idea that a nation should be made of virtuous civic-minded citizens that have the collective good at the front of their mind, and at the front of all of their actions and deeds. So basically, if you have civic virtue and the collective good at the front of your mind, then power cannot corrupt you as it does with monarchs, for example. And I think a lot of these ideas are going to be enumerated in this pamphlet called Common Sense by Thomas Paine. So this pamphlet was wildly influential. It was published in 1776. Now, this is after Lexington and Concord. It's after the Second Continental Congress, which we haven't talked about yet. It's after the Olive Branch Petition, which was sort of a last-ditch effort to prevent war. And it was after the Royal Proclamation of Rebellion. So Common Sense used very common language to argue for independence. This was really important because this means it was being read by non-elites. Non-elites were not reading Locke and Rousseau in philosophy. Okay, so this put it in very plain language for the middle classes to really understand. And just like the Enlightenment thinkers, he was arguing that the divine right is outdated. He argued that England was using its colonies, and there were really no economic benefits to the colonies for continued association with England. He said that American rights were being systematically stripped from them. And he also used some biblical examples to show the folly and the danger of monarchy. So essentially, the big significance of Common Sense is he made the argument widespread that the only way forward is independence. So that was the only option. And this is really a tipping point because, like I said, right up until this point, there are still a lot of colonists that did not believe that revolution was a good idea, that did not believe that independence from Britain was a good idea. They were British colonists and they wanted to stay that way. And this is really going to be a bit of a tipping point for many people, though not all, to tip towards a desire for independence. Okay, so last little bit we're going to talk about is obviously the Declaration of Independence. So in May of 1775, the Second Continental Congress is going to meet, and at this point, the focus is shifting to independence. At this point, there is a general recognition amongst most of the colonial leaders that Britain is not going to roll back its legislation that the colonists don't like. So at this point, there is a general argument that we need to declare independence, and Thomas Jefferson is charged with drafting a Declaration of Independence, which is full of Enlightenment ideas. So the general structure of the Declaration of Independence starts with John Locke's ideas of natural law and rights, and then in Rousseau's ideas of social contract and the rights of the governed. And then after those initial underpinnings, they move into basically a list of grievances that the colonists were saying, hey, we've endured these under British rule. Here's why we're mad. Here's why we want independence. And then ultimately it concludes with separation is the only possible option for us. So it basically lays out this argument for here's the ideological underpinnings, here's our grievances, conclusion, we must have independence. So I think it's worthwhile noting at this point, who is our independence for? In the Declaration of Independence, there's not a single mention of women, the enslaved, or American Indians. And they really weren't included in this concept of natural rights for all mankind. Now, it's worthwhile noting that the marginalized groups like women, the enslaved, people of color, American Indians, in the future are going to use this same language and reasoning to claim rights, to claim opportunity, to claim equality. And this is going to be a while in coming, as you probably already know, but it is definitely going to lay a framework for the argument that all people should have these same rights. Okay, so those are our ideological underpinnings of the American Revolution. We are going to be moving on in the next video to the American Revolution itself.